We're here with Charlie Maas, the CMO of RumChata. Well, actually, the former CMO. I hear there's been some really exciting news, and congratulations in order.
Yeah, we sold the RumChata brands to Gallo, the Gallo Wine Company, about a month ago. We're very excited about the possibility for the brand to really thrive in Gallo's care. They're the biggest wine company in the world, and they have their spirits division's been around 10, 15 years. They have some great brands, and just they're sort of the best in class in terms of execution at retail in our industry. And we are thrilled that they will be carrying on the RumChata name for let's say for the next 100 years or
100 or several hundred years, right? However long people continue to drink, probably into the future. Well, that's amazing. I'm so glad to be catching you at this time and, having this conversation.
Yeah, that's what we've been doing for it's been a while that has been in negotiation. And so it's sort of the calm after the storm now. You're sort of looking around like, what am I going to do next?
Well, huge congratulations. I know that's been an incredible journey, not just for you, but also for your family.
Yeah. My dad invented RumChata about 12 years ago. I was working at Saatchi & Saatchi at the time. I came over to RumChata, let's call it 7.5, 8 years ago. And we've been selling ever since. And so it's been a tremendous journey, a lot of fun working with my dad. But we're also very excited to hand the brand off to an amazing partner like Gallo and to get some sleep.
Right. And to not have everything rest on you, right? It's a big transition, I'm sure.
Yeah. I mean, our team at RumChata was amazing, and people really, we punched above our size as a small company. We were the second largest independently owned spirits brand in the United States. The largest is Tito's, which is the biggest brand in the whole country. And then we were about, call it 60th in terms of total sales volume through Nielsen. So, brands 2 to 59 were all owned by some giant conglomerate. And for our team to be able to compete with those massive multinational corporations is something we're really proud of. And everybody really, you didn't have one job. Everybody had about 4 or 5 different jobs and really pulled together. And that was very different than my previous career at agencies, where it's very siloed and you have your role and you stick to your role. It was a lot of fun to sort of see more of the business.
When you, and I know, a lot of this, I'm sure, is thinking about what's next for you and what's important. But as you think about your career so far, what do you view as the most influential decision that you've made to date?
That's a great question. I mean, deciding to come join RumChata was big for me because I was a broadcast producer at the ad agencies. And so I knew production very well. And then you work closely with the creatives. And so I knew that aspect of the advertising business. In terms of a general marketing understanding, I didn't know anything about pricing. I'd never thought about product sizes or packaging or route to market or any of that stuff. And so that was all learned on the fly. So that was one big jump to say, okay, I have a specialty of sorts in advertising. Let's see what the rest of the marketing world is like. And then after that, about 3 or 4 years ago, we did a strategic restage of the brand. And we really made a conscious choice to say, let's change the way we do things to make sure everything is there's a data-based reason for why we're doing anything. A lot of people talk about data-based decision-making at this point. But I think that we try to take it a step farther and say, okay, let's own our own data. Meaning, instead of prior, we had been using a marketing research firm that would, every 6 months they'd put out a bunch of questions, they'd give us an answer, and the answer would come in a 70-page PDF, and we'd walk through it. And oftentimes you'd read it and then put it away until the next 6 months. And we really wanted to shift the whole way of thinking to, if we have a question that comes up in any sort of meeting, is there a way that we can look back at the data in real time, cut it ourselves, see if we can find the answer? If we can't find the answer, then let's go back to the source and ask the question to, a large enough sample of people that we actually have an answer. Because that was a huge shift for us as a company, because we had a product that was really popular and had a lot of pull through at retail in the first few years. And then at a certain point, we hit a sales figure. We had huge sales numbers, especially for an independently owned brand. But we reached a point where we said, okay, the pull has stopped. So what do we have to do to get 5, 10, 20% growth in the next couple of years? And that really our approach to the business changed when it wasn't trying to keep up with demand, and all of a sudden we had to create demand.
And can you talk a little more about, I mean, I thought it was fascinating when you were explaining this when we last chatted about just how the shots space kind of works. Can you explain a little about that? Because I feel like we all will go, oh yeah, that makes sense. But I don't know that many of our listeners will be thinking about it that way.
Yeah. Shots and alcohol are a blessing until they're not, because you get a lot of volume and a lot of trial really quickly, but it's also cyclical. And so, when I was in college, people drank Jaeger bombs and they had shots of Jägermeister. And that brand, I don't know the exact number. I think they did 2-3 million cases in about 2010. Let's call that. A case is 12 bottles in a case, right? So they're doing 30 million bottles of Jaeger just in the United States. When Fireball got popular and people stopped taking Jaeger shots and they started drinking Fireball, Jaeger lost 1 million cases in about 2 years' time.
Wow.
And that's all just, if you have a group of 6 people who go up and say, okay, we're going to do a round of shots, that's a third of a bottle gone. And if that happens a couple of times in a night, you really, that's a great way to move volume. And so we were popular in a shot early on. We went from,
what was the shot?
The shot was, it was RumChata mixed with Fireball, and people called it a cinnamon toast crunch. And so you had, RumChata's cream based. So you had this sort of creamy dairy portion to it. Then both products had cinnamon in them. So you had it was a really approachable shot for a lot of people, because you had the Fireball, the sort of edgy whiskey side to it, but it also had a really easy flavor profile. So big groups of people could do it. And we had a couple years in a row where we grew, our volume quadrupled a year to 2-3 years in a row. And we were just worried about making enough product. And then when that shot sort of, it got replaced by something else in 2015, 2016, we had to look at the sales numbers and say, okay, how do we replace all that volume? And that's really when we took a much more in-depth look at who are our consumers, how are they consuming the product? How do they consume competitors? Where else can we, what other category entry points can we push to say, this is another way to use the product. This is another group of people who would like the product if they had heard about it. And that was all really based in an extensive amount of research we did on the consumer.
Oh, it's just a really fascinating thing to think about. And part of it is, I'm sure, about staying on top of trends, but how you create a trend of having millions of Americans suddenly want to start drinking this particular shot that may involve your drink, but may involve other drinks. And I mean, do companies in your space collaborate, or is it because there's so much cross ownership that in some cases some of these things come together? Or are these proactively marketed, or are these more grassroots sort of shots that happen?
Everybody tries to make the next big thing. Right? Yeah, they try to make something happen, and
it's kind of like trending on Twitter, right?
It's like the question of, it's like when you're in the agency world and someone says, well, give me a viral video. It's like, I can't do that. You can make a product you think is good and you hope people like it, whether that's a piece of video content or a liquor. We never imagined that our product would get popular as a shot. We really thought it'd be sort of an after dinner serve. And we're still grappling to this day with, how did that happen? Like, why is that? In the transition to Gallo, I've had a lot of conversations with them, and they've been wonderful trying to dig into why do people consume the brand and how do they feel about it. And the assumption everybody makes at first is, because it's another cream liqueur, they think the consumption is like Bailey's, and it's not. It's a much different approach that people have. There's a lot more community. It's not someone alone and drinking in front of a fire with a shawl over their shoulders. It's a group of people out doing something they love, enjoying life. It's more of a sense of community, and that that is not what we thought we were creating when we created the product. And so I think what's important is if you have a product that starts to sell at all, don't say, okay, this is why it's selling because this is what I made. And this is my assumption going into it. And so that's how we're going to keep selling the thing. I think it's really important to ask yourself, is the brand being used the way I thought it was going to be used? Is it the same consumer I thought? Because you might be really surprised. One example, and this was before we even, took more control of our data. The early times when we would do consumer research, consumption was pretty much 50-50, and everybody assumed it was pretty heavily female skewed. Our distributors, our retail partners, even we did.
Just because it was like sweet, or they just assumed women would go for that more?
Yeah, there was a little, I'll call it gender norming. Like we just thought it was a little bit more of a female focused product. It wasn't even 14% alcohol, it's 13.75. But I think the other thing is social media. You had a lot of women posting about the product. And if you only look at what's happening in social media, you're only hearing sort of the loudest voices. And there was a lot of consumption from men. And we've over 8 years of doing survey testing, it's always been 54-46 female to male. I've never even seen 60% in any of the 20 rounds of testing we did or of tracking studies we did. And so that's, I think when you're trying to create something that's going to be popular, it's really important to do some research, even if it's just whether it's social media or just out in public, looking at how people are consuming, do some research about who's consuming the product, how they're consuming it, because you might be surprised by the answer, especially a lot of entrepreneurs who have an idea and come into this, or even if you're not an entrepreneur, even if you're an R&D company in a giant corporation or someone in R&D, you might really be surprised who's consuming your product, because we certainly were.
Yeah, well, that ties into, I think, something that you said earlier around having this commitment to the truth, right? Mm-hmm. And I think that sometimes research or data and insights can be used in more of a confirmatory way, or, sometimes, if I'm going to be a little sort of bolder, like sometimes even in more of a CYA type way, right? Just to say, hey, this went great, I'm going to back my play. I went on my gut and hey, look, it worked out. Tell me a little about like how you practically made your data practice internal, what that took, like what it meant from a time commitment standpoint, and just, maybe even from a culture transformation standpoint.
Absolutely. So we were talking about this yesterday. I was in a unique position. It was a family company, so I have a lot of vested interest in its success, and I also have a lot of job security. So
right. And your dad's not going to be like, wow, great, you did a social media campaign, I'm so happy. It's like, it comes down to sales, right?
Yeah, we're always looking at the sales. And so I realized I had maybe more incentive, and I also had the protection to really say, okay, let's not try and pass everything off as a success. Let's see what worked and what didn't. And the way we really did that is when we switched our tracking study to YouGov, and they provided all our data it's the Crunch platform. It's like I think it's a Power BI platform. And so we were able to, in any meeting, I could pull up, the Hispanic consumer in California. What is the awareness over the last 9 quarters? I could cut the data any which way. We asked 3,000 people every 3 months, basic awareness stuff. And as you get more and more of that data, you really have the power to answer a lot of questions. And that wasn't actually all that expensive. It was the same cost on that research. We also at the time paid to get Nielsen, which we hadn't before. We invested a lot more money in all of the data that was available to us. And then also at the same time, as part of this journey, we became corporate sponsors of the Ehrenberg Bass Institute, the research institute that's put out the How Brands Grow books, which are very influential. And their corporate sponsorship program gives you access to all of their research. It's easily searchable, but also to their people. So we could email and ask them questions. Like I said, we're redoing our tracking study. Is this question formatting going to give me the right answer? And some of them, they say, yeah.
Are my leading people? Yeah.
Yeah. And they really helped us say, this is how you get the most usable data. So we made all these investments in consulting, in the actual data and new platforms, but then you have to invest the time to really understand them. I don't think we would have gotten as much out of it. And frankly, the first year or so that we had all these tools, we didn't get as much out of them as we did later on because we were still learning how to use them and what the, like physically, how to get the data, how to use it like that. But also you have to kind of wrap your head around this approach that you can answer any of these questions. If you're in a meeting and someone says, well, I wonder if perhaps people don't want to put RumChata in coffee, right? Well, I can go to YouGov. I can ask that question to 1,000 people overnight and I can have an answer tomorrow. And once you get in the mindset of we can get an answer to any of these questions, that sort of builds upon itself, and you have more confidence in your decisions and the programming that you're laying out there. And you also, I think in the end, you can own up if something didn't work. We invested a lot of money trying to push RumChata and coffee as a new consumption after the shot was falling off. And we didn't really move consumer behavior all that much. It was 10% in 2017 and it's 10% now. And being able to admit that that's not working, we were able to pare down some of our product offerings. We were able to focus on other messaging that works. But if I staked my whole year on, we're going to double coffee consumption with RumChata, and then I have to go answer for why that didn't work. I think the organization needs to put people, and this is another thing we discussed, top down from a leadership perspective. I wouldn't say reward people when they fail, but if they're willing to admit that something didn't work and they want to change it, if you empower those sorts of people and that sort of decision making, you're going to get a lot better results in the long run because people won't be afraid to fail. And so when it comes back to the data, I have a 40 question questionnaire over 9 quarters that we ask 3,000 people per time, right? So I have, 100,000 data points, maybe more. I could find the one that's going to say my program worked if I really wanted to in all of that. But
that your only criteria, right? Yeah.
Yeah. If I had to go defend this, whether it's for my bonus or for my job or just to keep my budget for the next year. And so I think there's a number of things we learned along the journey in terms of making your organization data focused. One is it's important for everybody who's involved in the marketing side to have access to the data and to understand it. And so we didn't have one analyst who would tell us what to do. I had a team of people. It was 4 of us. We would review every Nielsen drop. We would look through it state by state, size by size. I'd ask my team, what do you see? We would look at the tracking studies when they came in. If we were designing a new tracking study, I would ask my team, what are you wondering about? Is there a question you want to add to the study? Because I'm one person and I have my own opinions, and I've also been on the brand for 7 years. Our employee that we had hired last summer might have a very different opinion on things and might see things differently. I think that it's really easy to say, okay, we have an analyst over here, or we have someone who's pretty data focused. They get this stuff. Let's let them analyze it and we'll
run with it. Come back to us with the answers, right?
Yeah, come back to us with the answers, but they might not even ask the questions that you would ask. And that took a while for us to learn in terms of making the whole team more data focused and data centric.
Yeah, it's there's a certain messiness to it. You sort of have to get in the muck, and you can't sort of sit back on a pedestal and just kind of wait for things to surface. But it's, I think what you did there though is very unique, because I think it is one thing to say, hey, we want to be a data-driven organization. It's another thing to really move that through. You talked about and I feel like sometimes the commentary on this goes too far, where it's like reward failure, celebrate failure. Failure's not that great. It's not something you should strive for, but it's right. Okay. As long as there can be psychological safety around not being perfect and not always being right, as long as you're learning, how do you bring that to a culture? Because you don't want to go off on the other spectrum, which is just fail. That would be fantastic. Right. I think some of the books that cover this, it's almost like I should go out and try to fail, and that will be a success in itself, how do you practically speaking bring that into a culture? And you talk about, you maybe have that psychological safety because you feel like you have this job security, but, did your team feel more at risk because you were actually also an owner, or less so because they felt like they had air cover? Like, how did you personally bring that to your team and cross-functionally?
I hope they felt like they had more cover. I tried to emulate this piece of advice. I don't know how well of a job I did, but I heard once that like the basis of a good leader is to take the blame if things go wrong and share the credit if things go right. And that really provides people a environment to take manageable risks, right? I wouldn't, if something kept going wrong, you have to address it. But I think to give an example in our own journey, we came out with a new product in 2017, 2018. We called it Frappuccata. It was an iced coffee product, RumChata mixed with iced coffee, ready to drink. It was great. The liquid was great. And we advertised heavily and we tested awareness for a couple of years. And 2 years into the life cycle of the product, we had 3% national awareness on Frappuccata and we had 30% national awareness on RumChata. So 1 out of 10 RumChata drinkers knew the product existed. And this is, when I say advertised heavily, we spent, let's call it $2.5–3 million. Like, it was a big investment for us. And it hit me like a ton of bricks at one point that obviously the chata that we know is RumChata is not being connected to Frappuccata. And we were just too close to it. And we thought people would connect those names, and they didn't. And so we repackaged the product. We changed it to RumChata Cold Brew. And then we also were able to use that learning as we launched a couple other new products last year to say, okay, we have to have the RumChata name in its gold logo right across the front of the package. It's not well enough to loosely tie it to the brand. It has to be the exact same logo, same font, same everything. And this was also heavily influenced by a lot of the distinctive asset work that Ehrenberg Bass has done and that they push of like really the log line is figure out what your customers recognize and make sure that's across every package. And I think with a lot of the Ehrenberg, how brands grow, once you hear them, you're like, oh, of course, do that. And then you look at the brands out there that aren't doing that, myself included, and you're like, oh, wow, we need to do this. So that was one thing where, we failed. That product did not launch well. It did not do a great job. And we came back a couple of years later, we learned from it. And then last year, we were plus 34% cash value, according to Nielsen. The whole industry, the whole world was thrown out of whack last year, right? Our category was about plus 20. So we really outgrew the category. And it was because we had failed, but we also looked at that failure, tried to learn as much as we could, strengthened whatever those learnings were or confirmed them in the data. And then we came back and we improved upon that. And that's, I think about agency life where if you have one bad campaign or you have a bad year, you might lose the account. That is just not conducive to long-term good work because people are constantly, the incentives there are to really try and you're not incentivizing people to learn and grow and do a better job over the long run. You're incentivizing them to, put lipstick on a pig and try to make a failure look like a success. And that's, if you're doing that, you can never really have a realistic discussion about what's working and what's not and how do we improve.
Yeah. And I wonder if it's that sometimes, when you go into campaign measurement, something that I know worries me in our business where you go, gosh, everything's already been done, right? All the money has been spent. All the presentations have been given. Everyone's so excited. And then they huddle together and go, how did it go? You're like, oh man, it's the stakes are so high and, people have put on their Sunday best to sort of see the results. And you're like, I guess, if there's a different sort of approach than if you're sort of approaching it going, hey, this is an opportunity to make the next campaign better and to really sort of get takeaways. I think there's one which is like confirmatory and another which is exploratory. But it is, I mean, it's really hard. And I think agencies, perhaps even more than pre-COVID, I think are put in that spot where, it's very hard to say, hey, this didn't work, but here's what we learned. It's sort of everyone wants the person who has the magical answer for everything, where every campaign always works. And that's just not reality.
Yeah, it's funny, as you were saying that, I thought of the scientific method, like from 400 years ago. And when I was growing up, when we learned this in school, I'd think, why bother making a hypothesis to start? Why don't you just see what happens with the experiment? And you'll just figure it out from the experiment. But I think in the sense of like looking back on a campaign, it would probably be pretty helpful up front to say, this is what we think is going to happen. So then later on, you can't just dig through this mound of data or this mound of results for whichever one might support your claim. You can really hold yourself to, this is what we intended to do and this is what we thought would happen. Did it happen? And I think that grounds your analysis more in reality, because if you say I put together a whole campaign and I'm trying to sell, let's just call it RumChata, to people over 60. If in the end, it turns out that I look at all this data and wow, engagement in the campaign was up massively for people 21 to 40. Okay, great. That's great. I can put that into a deck somewhere, but I didn't accomplish my goal. How am I ever going to recreate that if I wasn't even trying to do that from the get-go? And I think there is a sense when you start looking backwards at a campaign, especially if the sales numbers didn't go the way you wanted to, or you didn't get the viewership numbers or whatever the engagement, there's a temptation to say, okay, we have 10,000 metrics here. Let's find the 10 best for us. And
Tuesday nights between 6 and 7 p.m. we were the winners.
Yeah. And I just long-term, if it's like throwing darts blind, right? I mean, you might hit a bullseye once, but you're not going to really be able to recreate that when you try and come back and do the next campaign.
I had this thought last year, and I was thinking around, I was like, okay, I'm a believer, right? Like, I believe data and insights are incredibly important. Of course I do. I founded a company around it. But, I had this theme around like essential services, and, can you go through your life and be, in many respects, a great marketer or a great content creator or a wonderful creative without ever looking at data? Probably. Like, could you be better? Maybe, right? How do you think about that? Is that not the right lens? Like, what is it about the data and insights that you've used that potentially are arguably more of an essential services and a must-have than sort of a luxury? And I think maybe my question ties into, if you're only using data to back your play and prove that something that you already were going to do anyway was the right thing, then it's probably not essential, right? Because you can just talk it up, you can create great slides, you can pull some verbatims and everyone's happy. But what in that process potentially makes data an essential service?
That's an interesting question. I mean, coming from an organization that we didn't have the Nielsen consumer sales data or any consumer sales data for the first 5 years I was working there. And we had other ways to measure the success of the business. We had our own shipments, we had depletions, but depletions for us is kind of halfway between consumer sales and shipments. But it was eye-opening once we had that data, that's the end goal, I guess is what I'm trying to get at, right? Like, I can dress up awareness numbers and I can say our purchase intent is up and the consumption metrics and we're reaching older people. But if you're not selling more product in the end, you're going to have to close the doors, right? What's the point? And even I know some businesses, organizations are probably think, well, sales isn't the point. We're a nonprofit. We're trying to help people, but you have to sell whatever you're doing. You have to sell that service,
or it's
there's something there that you have to bring in to keep the lights on. And even if you're trying to sell, people on a public health measure, for example, right? Like you have to be able to sell that and get people to come in. I think about all of the talk now about how to get people to come in and be vaccinated, right? Like that is a sales challenge. I hope they're looking at it like a sales challenge as much as like a public health challenge. And so you have to know who's not coming in and getting vaccinated, so you can reach those people to meet their use, right? And so if you don't have access to your sales metric, if you're looking at every campaign based on engagement or awareness numbers or any other number of things, it's like you're playing the game, but you're not looking at the scoreboard in the end, right? I think that's something that's integral for people to understand. And then with any campaign, there are smaller goals, right? I can't sell liquor directly over the internet. So it doesn't make sense for me to say, okay, I put this video up online. What has happened to I can't measure my direct sales generated from that because it's not possible in my industry. So I have to have another metric to say, was it reach that I was looking for? Is it the time, someone watched the video? Is it the amount of engagement, the way it was shared? The demographics of people who saw it, I think any of those things, you have your broader sales goals for your whole organization. And then for a smaller campaign, you have to have a specific goal in mind. And that's what's really integral. We early on at RumChata, back before they changed a lot of the sort of Facebook algorithms, we could post content to Facebook and get 100,000 shares on it and millions of people seeing it organically. And now you can't get any of that stuff. But once we checked under the hood of that, with the top line data looked great. We didn't really bother to think about it much beyond that because these big numbers were flashing in our face. And then you could go see the frequency, and some people were seeing it 10, 12 times. And so that million people who saw it is actually maybe 100,000. It doesn't look as successful now, but I think for every business, the data that's going to be essential for you is going to be slightly different, but there's the big pie in the sky sales number that you always have to have an eye on. And then beyond that, for your specific campaigns, you should have an actual target you're looking for. And that's what is really going to be integral to you in that instance.
Yeah, no, that's great advice. So when you're at a really, fun inflection point, what's exciting for you right now as you stare out into the future?
Well, it's been a really strange year for everyone, right? And I have a lot of sympathy. We were in an industry that benefited from a lot of these lockdowns. People were at home more. They were purchasing more spirits. I have a ton of sympathy for our partners in bars and restaurants. A lot of people lost their jobs, lost their businesses. And I hope all those people get back to work and those businesses can really thrive again. But going forward, after you see economic disruptions like this, you oftentimes see a lot of innovation, entrepreneurship. And I think you're going to see in the next 5 to 10 years, a ton of new businesses and new ideas that came out of people who, they maybe they didn't have the stability they thought they had at that one job. And it gave them that push to go try and start their own business. So I'm excited to see how people respond in the next 5 to 10 years, the new businesses that crop up. Personally, having come from a medium-sized family business that we just went through this journey. I've spent the last 4 years trying to say, how do we build out an operation so we can make as sound decisions as these big multinational corporations we're competing against and their gigantic advertising agencies? How do I get the data and the insights to be able to compete with them with the resources and frankly, the financial wherewithal of a small company? And that's what I've done for the last 4 or 5 years. And so on a personal level, I'm excited to see a lot of these young companies grow, become mid-sized companies. And then I would love to give you all advice on how to make that leap from, okay, we had a great product and we've grown this business more than we ever thought we would. Now we need to really take a look at our consumer, at our market, at the the demographic trends happening, and make better decisions going forward, because we're not sort of on that rocket ship now. Now it's about grinding out steady growth and reaching new people. And so I'm excited for that in the macro sense for the whole world, to see the type of things that come out in the next 5 to 10 years. And I hope I get a chance to advise some of those people with some of the skills I've developed recently.
And when you do, I was going to say if you do, when you do, what would be the top piece of advice that you have for entrepreneurs, newly minted entrepreneurs that might be going out, they might have found a little bit of a niche and they're, figuring it out much the same way you did, 4 or 5 years ago?
I would say this is so funny because I'm going to just undo everything I just said. Early on, don't rely on research. If you have an idea, if you have a business you think can succeed, you're going to have to pour so much heart and passion into that and time. You have to believe in it fully. And if we had researched in 2009 what people want out of a cream liqueur, they would have told us they want Irish whiskey and chocolate, and they would have made Baileys because that's all they knew. Steve Jobs, I can't believe I'm comparing RumChata to Steve Jobs, but if he had asked a bunch of people in, 1999, how they want to listen to music, they would have described a Walkman or a Discman. They would not have described the iPod. They couldn't have, right? And so my advice to any entrepreneur is if you have an idea that you love, put your head down, create the best version of that product that you can and try and get it out there to as many people to start. And if people like it and they start to pick it up and it's successful, then it's time to worry about who's consuming this, why, where. But before then, I don't think any of that, all of the data that I've just talked about so glowingly for the last 40 minutes, I don't think it's helpful until you really have the product out there and you've seen if people are going to take to it, because it's really hard for people to imagine what they want. I think that would be my advice to anyone starting a new business is you have to believe in your own idea, because so many businesses don't work out that if you don't believe in it, you're just not going to be able to get through all the challenges it's going to take to get it to market.
Yeah, I think it's, I think a fun way that data was once described to me was like thinking of it almost as like a sword or a shield, right? And you can use it to create reasons why something won't work, or to worry more, or to say, hey, I need more time to think about this and test it. And yeah, sometimes early on, you just sort of have to go, right?
Well, the data is tremendous at telling you the truth about what is happening, right? But it's really hard to use the data to project what's going to happen or what people want. And I think you can look at the liquor industry. One person comes out with a flavor that works of a product, and you will see that in every other product there is out there. It's a copycat industry. That's what happens. But you can't look at the flavors that are succeeding right now and then project ahead to say, oh, all of a sudden people are going to want to jump to a cinnamon whiskey or a peach whiskey, or a pink lemonade vodka is really going to blow up. Like these are all products that have become, $100 million products in the last 5 to 10 years. And no amount of research before they were out there would have told you that's what consumers want. And so, yeah, I think the sword and the shield analysis is that's interesting. And I think we talked about that in terms of whether you're using the data to defend what you're doing or really kind of actively try and figure out. I think that's an interesting parallel there. I almost think of it like, I don't know, like a history book or I don't know. I was going to say a time machine, but that's not really right. But like forward looking or backwards looking, I think the data really should oftentimes be used to ask what is actually happening and how can we adjust, as opposed to what do we think is going to happen in the next couple of years.
Yeah, no, I love that. Last question for you. If you could go back in time when you first, like either to the start of your career or if you want from when you first came on board at RumChata, what is the one thing that you wish you would have known right then?
The one thing, there's so many. I think, one thing in the bridge between my time at Saatchi & Saatchi and RumChata, I really thought about the creatives are going to be so mad at me for saying this, but I really used to think that a great idea can really carry a brand and carry awareness. And a clever piece of content or something like that. And if you don't have an understanding of how you're going to get that, any sort of message in communications, if you don't have an understanding of who you're going to deliver it to and how, it doesn't matter how good the message is. I think of, if you wrote the greatest rock and roll song ever before there was a radio, you're not really going to get that song out to a lot of people. You're not going to become the Beatles. It's one thing I think early on, and particularly now in when we see small brands doing really great things online, people think, oh, all I need is one great piece of content, or I need, I feel like brands don't do this anymore, but oftentimes they used to ask for that viral video, 5-6 years ago.
Oh,
and
that's still a thing. It's still a thing.
It's still happening. Okay. That's not, instead of focusing on what the content is going to be of the message. And I guess if you looked at a larger business perspective, what the specific product is, you have to know what the route to market is going to be, or else you haven't fully thought out the whole business. You've only thought out a little portion of it. And then the other specific advice I would give to myself, if I could go back 8 years, would be really invest your time in understanding the data around who your consumer is, why they're consuming, and make that a focal point for your own decision making. Because that, and again, I jumped at RumChata when the brand was doing 250,000 cases. So we already knew the product was working. We had gotten through that first phase of sort of blind faith, right? Once you take the blinders off, I think we could have made some of these adjustments earlier on, but it's a journey and you learn a lot along the way. And as long as you are learning from some of those things that don't go as well as maybe you like, I think in the long run, you'll add more skills and you'll add a better perspective. And that's one way to succeed in business. So I try to have a little compassion for myself 8 years ago, who was trying to learn a lot of different parts of the business and focused originally on the ones that he knew the best. Yeah, that was a little rambling, but I'm getting nostalgic, I suppose, now towards the end of my time at RumChata. So.
Oh, that's incredible. Well, listen, thank you so much for sharing your story. It's so great to have you on, and I'm very excited for all the entrepreneurs that you will be supporting in the coming weeks, months, and years as you sort of bring what you've learned out into the world.
Well, thanks so much. I'm looking forward to it. It should be a fun few years. So, yeah, thank you so much for having me on. This was a great conversation.
Terrific. Thanks.